Hello, friend. Welcome to this week's episode of the Remarkable People podcast, the Dr. Leland Stillman story. This week is packed. Our episode is deep and meaningful and can help all of us in our lives not just understand what's going on in society, not just what's going on inside our bodies and those around us, not just understand what's going on politically and globally when it comes to healthcare, wellness, and quote unquote the science. But this episode, we talk about the Bible and we discuss how even if you're not a believer, all of the science described in the Bible has come true. And we can use that to live a healthier, longer life. And we talk about how what Dr. Leland experienced as a child and his sister, and how the mom was in search of health and then how he became an MD. He is a medical doctor, but then he chose to balance the MD with what some people call alternative medicine or integrative medicine, all sorts of different terms. But he encompasses all knowledge from God and balances it so his patients and clients and friends and us as listeners can have even better life. We go to places that it challenged me. I didn't even mention to him the first time he's going to hear about it is when he's watching this intro. But it made me, as soon as the episode was over, to go back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3 and catch up on my reading and pray and meditate about some of the verses that I might have not seen some basic biblical knowledge. So when you watch the episode, you'll probably pick up on it too. And I'd be interested to send me an email and notes or what your thoughts are. So at this time, I'm actually going to put my glasses on for the first time I've ever done an intro in 5 years. And I'm going to look at my notes because there was just so much in this episode. We talk about why our children are suffering. We talk about how the medical industry tricked the earth. We talked about pharmaceutical and how it ties back throughout history and what it means for us today. And we even talked about the suicide rates among physicians, male and female, and how it's exponentially higher, sadly, than the regular old Joe that just gets up and goes to a blue collar or white collar work every day. And then we talk about a whole lot more. One of the things that was really interesting to me is how we got to believe the bunk during COVID that the governments put out and not the science. They said, follow the science, follow the science. And there was no science in their science, total BS. So Dr. Leland talks about what he believes, how we got brainwashed as a society and believed not science, but fiction. So there's a whole lot and more in this episode. You can listen to it. It's enjoyable. It's entertaining. But if you apply it, it's actually practical as well, like all of our episodes, hopefully, right? We want to be here to glorify God and help you grow. And I'm thinking this episode's going to do it. So we're going to have a quick sponsor commercial. Then at the end of the commercial, you're going to get into the episode with our friend, Dr. Leland. Enjoy. Hello, friends. I know you're ready and pumped for this episode with Dr. Leland. But before I go forward, I just want to thank our sponsor, My Pillow, but tell you about their latest product. They have a new mattress topper that's based on the technology in their pillows. It is amazing. When I saw it, I thought it looks like an 8 crate mattress from the 80s with smaller bumps, but it is nothing like it. We ordered one, put it in our guest room. We had an old fashioned coil mattress, and then we had a nice latex foam mattress. Both are brand new, but one was a whole lot more comfortable than the other. So we took this My Pillow 3-inch mattress topper, which is super inexpensive. When you use promo code Remarkable, I think it takes 30 to 80% off, but I'm almost positive it's like $69 only. And that was for the twin. It might be a little bit more for the queen or the king, but man, you talk about a transformation. Now we can go into the guest room, pull down the spring coil, old technology, and with this 3-inch mattress topper that costs less than $100 with promo code Remarkable, got amazing night's sleep. So now when guests come over, we have two beautiful mattresses that are ultra comfortable. So go to mypillow.com/remarkable, shop to your heart's content for any of their products. Every single one I've tried, I have loved, or I wouldn't be here making this commercial. And when you use promo code Remarkable, you get 30, 80% off your order. So you save a ton of money. You get awesome quality products. You're going to sleep better. In this case, your guests may sleep better, and you're going to help a great American company continue to thrive, take care of American families, and bring back to all of our communities. So I'm David Pasqualone. Go shop My Pillow and enjoy this great episode with our friend, Dr. Leland. Hey, Leland, how are you today, brother?
Great, David. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure and an honor. I just told our listeners around the world a little bit about you and what to expect in today's show. But before we get going in your story, they know we're going to go through from your birth through today. Then we'll transition to where are you today and where are you heading next. But if someone's going to stick to this show and listen to the entire hour, half an hour, 2 hours, whatever it ends up being, what do you guarantee they're going to get that's going to benefit their life by the end of this show?
Wow. Here's the thing that you're going to get. You're going to get a really clear understanding of why modern people are really sick. And most of them aren't sure why. And most of them feel like they're spinning their wheels when it comes to achieving the well-being that they desire.
Awesome.
How's that?
Yeah. Beautiful. If it's your show, man, it's whatever you're going to promise. And we got to make sure you come through by the end, which you will. So let's do this. Something happened, or many things happened in your life that made this so important to you and such a passion. And you're also an MD. So talk to us. Let's start at the beginning. Where were you born? What was your upbringing like? Good, bad, or ugly?
I was born in Manhattan, New York City, Upper East Side, 1988, and pretty typical Upper East Side family. Both parents worked, professionals. They'd been, Ivy League educated from very, successful families. And my sister and I were born to my mother late in her life, which is part of why we had various medical issues. I had a lot of ear infections, sinus infections, sore throats. My sister Adrienne had similar issues, and then her eyes crossed. So she ended up having to have a surgery to correct that. And this is, increasingly common. This was the late 80s, early 90s. People's health in this country really started to deteriorate around the 50s and 60s as processed food, television, technology started to really proliferate. And that, in a nutshell, is why modern people are sick. But at the time, there wasn't the level of awareness about it that there is now. And also, people were, in general, healthier. But my mother tells this great story of taking my sister to have an operation to drain her sinuses after she developed a particularly nasty sinus infection. And she looks up at the ENT doctor and says, that's ear, nose, and throat, and says, this is it. We've cured the problem. It's solved. It's fixed. And she's going to have a normal life now, right? And he says, no, in all likelihood, she's going to need another surgery because the holes we've drilled into her sinuses are going to heal. And we're just going to have to go back and do this again. Meanwhile, my poor little sister is vomiting into an emesis basin. And my mother left that encounter with a physician saying, this is insane. There's no way I can settle for this level of mediocrity when it comes to the health of my children. I have to try something different, even if it's weird and new and different. She then took us into the alternative integrative medicine world, which, as most of your listeners probably know, is a pretty wild, wacky place with all sorts of different characters. And she took us to homeopaths, herbalists, dowsers, astrologers, people who did traditional Chinese or Southeast Asian medicine. I mean, we saw a huge variety of people. Now, I was just a little kid, but this went on up until I was a teenager, up until I left home for college, and I was fascinated by everything. I was very sure that a lot of it was bunk. I just wasn't sure what was bunk and what was real. And I wanted to know. So I read books and I listened to I mean, not at the time podcasts, but like I basically listened to and consumed all the content I could get my hands on. Found a mentor who was a naturopath. He, frankly, was pretty off the rails himself, but at the time I didn't know any better because I was a teenager. He told me to go to medical school. I went through undergrad, did very well, went to medical school, and then I specialized in internal medicine, which is, I would say, it's internal medicine is about, it's very much about science and physiology, and you really only take care of sick adults. It's of all the specialties of medicine, it's the most invested in understanding really the fundamentals of how people work, from vital organs to basic physiology like heart and lungs, how they pump, how they move blood around the body, how the blood's oxygenated, all that stuff.
Yeah, and
So I
isn't
was,
internal
yeah.
medicine an extra 4 to 8 years of schooling beyond medical school?
So medical school's 4 years, internal medicine residency is 3.
3. Okay. I
And
knew it was
then
an additional commitment.
you can do an additional fellowship, which is another 2 to 3 years. And you can do other things like MD PhDs, which are another 4 years. So there's a lot of different ways that people get their schooling and come out. But I eventually came out, and I was very disillusioned with the conventional medical world. I'd been pretty hostile to it to begin with, but I went because I wanted to learn and because I knew it had a lot to offer. I just wasn't sure what it had to offer. And, even people within the conventional medical field will sometimes quote the physician who founded Johns Hopkins Medical School. He said to a graduating medical school class back in the 1800s, he said, we have taught you, half of what we've taught you is wrong. The problem is we don't know what half. And I had professors in medical school tell me that same thing, in 2012, 2013, when I was going through. So I've always been fascinated by, how do people really work? What actually gets people well? What actually makes them sick? And then once they've become ill, how do we actually get them back to wellness? And so that's the basic journey. And then, that was 10 years ago now that I can't believe this. It's been 10 years since I graduated from medical school, and 6 years since I left, no, 7 years since I left my residency program in 2017. And since then I've traveled all over the country practicing. I've practiced from, Colorado to Maine to Florida. I have patients from Washington State to Maine to South Africa and Mexico. And we do what I call integrative medicine. Sometimes it's called functional medicine. And we focus on everything that really matters to getting people healthy and well. And that's the short version of the story.
And what were some of the things, I know you mentioned like sinus infections and different illnesses and conditions you struggled with. What were some of the conditions that even into your teens and adulthood that you struggled with that you found solutions for?
So it started with ear infections, sore throats, sinus infections, sinusitis, what we would call sort of bread and butter allergy symptoms for a kid. And then as I got older, I was very bright. I was very motivated in school, but I was small and I was weak and I was not athletic. And I was frustrated by that. And I had what would be conventionally called ADHD, but I really dislike the way that psychiatric diseases are diagnosed, because I think that, at the end of the day, it's the pharmaceutical industry that ultimately decides, by picking and choosing the experts who define what psychiatric illnesses are. They ultimately decide what psychiatric illnesses are, and they have a nasty way of pathologizing normal behavior. And so I think we have an epidemic of young people in this country who are told that they're anxious, they're told they're depressed, they're told that they have ADHD or they have OCD. And there may be an element of truth to that, but unfortunately, if you take a really smart kid and put him in a really boring classroom, he's going to look like he's crawling out of his skin because he's bored. And that was me. I thought that school was hopelessly boring. I couldn't stand the lessons I was handed. A lot of my behavioral issues disappeared when I moved to a Montessori school, where I was very independent and got to do what I felt I should do in order to study things. And there's a time and place for people having to do things they don't want to do. And there's a time and a place for structure and order, but there's also a time and place for letting kids be kids. I mean, one of the great crimes, I think, of the modern educational system is that these people have this idea that we need to have more weeks of school and more hours of school per day. And these poor kids are going to be cooped up in these 100% artificially lit buildings. They're never going to have time outside. If they do have time outside, it's 10 or 20 minutes. And increasingly, kids are not allowed to be kids. You know, when you let kids go outside and be themselves, they'll climb trees, they'll play in the mud, they'll fall down hills, they'll get into all kinds of trouble. You know, you and I are both old enough to remember when kids were allowed to go out and do dangerous things, and that was normal. And now increasingly, I hear that kids are expected to stay indoors and be on their best behavior. And sadly, society is achieving this by handing kids the electronic babysitter, the tablet, the smartphone, the computer, the television, whatever. And these kids are turning into these predictably anxious, ADHD, depressed teenagers and young adults. And it's not a mystery to me. It's very clearly happening because people are, you know, it's, if you were to put a plant in a closet or put a tarp over it so it didn't get any sunlight, you wouldn't be surprised when it died. Mm-hmm. Human beings require light, and we're really specifically wired for sunlight for optimal health. And yet people wonder why everyone is getting sick and depressed and anxious and whatever when they live indoors in these artificially lit buildings with very little, if any, natural light. This is not rocket science, nor is it, I think, controversial, even though most doctors don't talk about it. It's just a logical consequence of what happens when you put people in artificial, unnatural light. So those are the kinds of issues that I dealt with in childhood. And then in my teenage years, you know, I turned into like a healthy adult, but I was still, I don't think I was happy, and I wasn't a very, I guess I would say, calm, well-adjusted person. And partly that was driven by the fact that medical school and residency are a recipe for, I mean, they're incredibly high stress. There's very little time for yourself. You know, you look at doctors sadly have a suicide rate that's for male physicians have a suicide rate, and this is for completion of suicide, not just attempts, that's 1.5 times the average male. And so step back and think about that. We're comparing them to all males in society, and they've got a high income job. They've got a high level of educational attainment. They have a lot of opportunity and a lot of advantages in life, we might say, and yet they have, you know, 150% or 1.5 times the risk of dying by suicide compared to their average male countrymen in America. Women, it's even worse. The average female physician has a risk of suicide that's 2.25 times the risk of the average American woman. That's incredible, and I think totally tragic, and reflects how pathological, how sick, how dysfunctional the modern healthcare system is for doctors. And then patients, you know, it should be no surprise to patients hearing that. No wonder your doctor, you know, this is the stuff I hear from patients all the time. My doctor doesn't have empathy. He doesn't listen to me. He doesn't care. I feel like I'm a number. This just feels like it's, you know, it's like, I feel like I'm on a conveyor belt. I've heard it called, you know, modern medical care being called cattle care. I feel like I'm just a cattle in a chute being, you know, guided along in some kind of factory. Very sad how patients feel. But the sad thing is that a lot of them don't ever hear that their doctor's actually just as unhappy with the system as they are. So all that stress left me in my late 20s, early 30s, healthy, but I wasn't really, I would say, like full of life. And that was when I started to really get deep into what I would call the best of functional and integrative medicine. And that unlocked for me a whole new level of vitality, energy. And then I started to train with my lead health coach, Jim Laird. And he worked with me and trained me for about a year when we split a house together in Tampa, St. Pete area. I now live in Naples, Florida. And as part of living together, he ended up taking me to the gym with him every week, 2 or 3 times a week. I had never spent any time in the gym. I was 160 pounds when we started working together and 6 feet tall. I was pretty thin, rail thin. And after 6 months, I was 180 pounds. And obviously my height didn't change because I was 30 something. So that was, I mean, that's, I'm in the best shape of my life, and I really attribute that to the whole journey of learning how to properly nourish my body, how to train, my daily routine, everything is dialed in. And, we see it very predictably with patients in the medical practice. And we have a coaching business where Jim and I coach people into how to be healthy and well, and where we also train practitioners in hair tissue mineral analysis, which is my favorite type of test. And we see it very predictably. People come in, we teach them, we train them, they implement, they execute on what we recommend, and they see the results so long as they stick with the program. So that was the journey. And that was the kinds of things that I overcame over the years.
Yeah, and so many questions and so many things to comment on. But, when you bring up the stats on the suicide rate, I remember
Mm,
researching this deeply in the 90s because I was sick. I had a tumor in my head. It
yeah.
was long story, but I remember researching then that the average lifespan of a doctor was in the late 50s, 55 to 58. And the
Yes.
average lifespan of anybody else around the world is just like the Bible says, 70 to 80 years. So you can smoke, drink, do drugs, but you don't have that stress in your life. So you average 75 years. Not
Mm-hmm.
that you should do that. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just saying
Right.
the normal person at that point, it was lining up perfect with the Bible as always, 70, 80 years lifespan, but doctors were 50 to 58. Do
Mm-hmm.
you know by any chance? Have you heard the same stats? Do you know what a more recent stat is?
The last I checked, I saw that a study that compared doctors to lawyers, and it showed that doctors, because doctors and lawyers are a pretty good group to compare,
Yes, yes, both similar
similar
stress.
levels of income, education, they're office workers, they're largely sedentary in their work. So that comparison, they showed that doctors don't live longer than lawyers, and the numbers were about the same as the average person. But I don't give doctors a pass on living as long as the average person, because that means that despite having gone to school for, a grand total of at least 8 years of higher education, and not to mention 3 to 7 years of residency, plus any potential, you know, post residency fellowships and specializations and certifications. And I mean, the average doctor might do a couple $1,000s worth of continuing education every year. You mean to tell me that they do all of that school and all of that work, and they can go to work and they can make anywhere from 100 and something dollars an hour up to, there's surgeons out there who, if they work, and generally speaking, surgeons work more than full time. They're almost always working 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week, but they might be, paid 700 to $1 million or more a year, depending on what kind of work they're doing. So you're telling me that they work all that time, do all that education to have a average outcome. And that just speaks to me of, I mean, not knowing how to be healthy. It's not that the trauma surgeon doesn't know how to sew up a lacerated thigh, or the neurosurgeon doesn't know how to relieve compression in the cranium. It's that you start quizzing that neurosurgeon about his plan to live to 85, 95, 100, 120, which is feasible, possible. People do it all the time. And they're going to, I sometimes joke with patients that the average doctor has enough health and wellness advice to fit on a 3x5 index card. And once you've covered that material, they really don't have anything else for you. And one of the things that's been amazing to me is that once I got really well versed in how do you get people well and keep them there, what matters about everything from light to daily routine to exercise to supplements to, attitude and mindset, the number one and two reasons people failed to get results that I saw in my practice, and this is people who I'm coaching in the coaching practice or treating as a doctor in the medical practice, the number one and two reasons were failure to execute and failure to engage. So they weren't doing the things that had been recommended, or they weren't engaging with myself or my staff in order to overcome obstacles. Because anyone who wants to achieve great things, like Tom Brady doesn't become arguably the greatest of all time, or any other, athlete you want to use as an example. They don't become the greatest by checking in with a coach every year. And yet people expect, oh, well, I'm going to go see my doctor once a year and I'm going to be healthy. That's a recipe for disaster, or at least a recipe for mediocrity. I can give you an idea of where you are in a single meeting, but if you want to have a trajectory from illness to wellness, someone on my team has to be touching base with you once a week, every couple of weeks, once a month, at least every quarter. And that's the pretty standard operating procedure in the practice. When someone comes in and says, I'm sick, I have these lab abnormalities, I want to be well, I want to be as healthy as possible. That's not just a matter of, oh, your cholesterol's fine or it's terrible, take a statin. We don't recommend or prescribe statins, for the record. But, people have this, tragically simplistic view of health that's been created by the medical industry. And it's really been created because at the end of the day, I mentioned the reimbursement for doctors. People get really good at doing what you pay them to do, but life's not as simple as just you pay people to, you have to pay attention to what you're paying them to do. So like, for example, a surgeon gets paid to minimize the number of people who die on the operating table and the number of people who make it through the surgery successfully. Your orthopedic surgeon doesn't get paid to minimize your knee pain 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So if you ask him, how do I minimize my risk of having this knee pain that you're operating on me for, doing a total joint replacement for 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, you're not actually paying him to do that. You're paying him to replace your joint now, which is why we have countless people in the practice who've had a joint replacement, who've had their pain come back. And we look at their biomechanics, how they're moving, how they're lifting, their daily routine. And we say, well, here's why, A, you needed that joint replacement in the first place, which nobody goes to their orthopedic surgeon and says, I'm only interested in paying you if you're going to figure out why I have knee pain. They're going to say, well, you got a meniscal tear, you've got osteoarthritis, you've got this, you've got that. Sadly, it's not that we can't figure out or deduce why you got this pain beyond just, well, you had a bad meniscus, well, you blew it out in a football game in college. We'll find movement patterns in people. Jim, our strength and conditioning coach, specifically will do this. He'll find how their movement patterns are destroying their joints, and he'll help them compensate or cope with or manage the damage that's already been done, and figure out, well, how can I still, say, go to the gym and lift weights without continuing to wear out this joint? Because that's one of the things that really, it evades people. They don't see it. You might spend 15 years running to set yourself up for a joint replacement. You might spend 20, 30, 40 years lifting heavy weights in the gym to set yourself up for shoulder pain or a rotator cuff problem. And it's the true calling, I think, for me anyway, particularly, but for any physician, is really, can you spot what someone's doing now that's going to be their heart attack, their stroke, their cancer, their joint replacement in 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years? And that, to me, is the greatest value that a physician can bring to the table. And it's remarkable what you find when you start to actually, because the way our model is set up, if people are curious, is we have a practice that's members only, and our job is to keep people healthy and well. So there's a membership fee, and there's a la carte pricing for services above and beyond our standard, this is what's included per year. But the reality is, our goal with everyone is to get them so healthy that they need us as little as possible, which is a completely different model than the fee for service, which frankly, the way that hospitals and clinics maximize their revenue is by saying to everyone, well, your labs are normal, come back next year. Well, then they wind up in the ICU, the ER, they're having their first heart attack, they're diagnosed with their first stroke, their first cancer. And they say, well, why didn't we detect this problem? How did we not prevent this? I've had people come in who are having their first heart attack. They say, I just ran a 5K last week. What do you mean I'm having a heart attack? And it was always that the system is built to, frankly, not deliver optimal health, but to patch tires, put out fires, and that's it. And so predictably, people develop all these problems under the hood, and then these problems end up turning into these major health crises. And when you start to view the case through the lens of, well, coming down the line? What's 5, 10, 15, 20 years in this person's future? And you start to really do more advanced lab testing and diet and lifestyle counseling, your whole world opens up to what's possible as far as keeping people healthy and well, and also unlocking, higher and higher levels of performance. So anyway, yeah, it's fascinating to me that doctors don't live longer than the average person, but it's because no one's paying them to learn how to be healthy. Everyone is just, well, my foot's on fire right now. What have you got for me in the next 30 minutes, hour, couple weeks? And that's why we're in such a disaster of a healthcare crisis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, so many people want that immediate solution or gratification, and they're willing to go under and get cut open in a system that's what they get paid to do. When
Right.
really, okay, 6 weeks of physical therapy it corrects the root of the problem. But people don't want to put that in, but they're willing to have back surgery. So there's always a place. There's a balance between traditional and, other alternative medicine. But it boggles my mind how people are so willing to trust doctors blindly. I mean, even I'll say it flat out. Fauci comes out and people like follow the
No,
science.
right.
There's no
Yeah.
freaking science in that.
But do
Um,
you want to know why that happened?
well, I can tell you, I mean, we all know corruption, but I mean, stopping a
I mean,
particle.
why the medical establishment was so successful in gaining the public's trust.
Yeah, do it.
So there's this great book called The Body Electric, eye-opening as far as how our bodies are electromagnetic beings. The Bible says we're beings of light. It couldn't be more true. In The Body Electric, the foreword, the preface by the author Robert Becker. Robert Becker was an orthopedic surgeon who discovered the electrical properties of bone, which is fascinating. He created the first bone stimulators to heal bones that wouldn't come together, that wouldn't heal. He describes what it was like, and I get chills running up and down my spine when I talk about this because it's so powerful to talk about as someone who's worked in a hospital with people who were, dead and dying. He describes what it was like to be a medical student on the wards at Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan in the I think it was teens or 20s, when antibiotics had just been invented. And for people who don't know this, it used to be that people got to 60, 65, 70, 75, and out of the blue, they would develop pneumonia. And that pneumonia would build and it would get worse. And it was a wet cough, and then they would spike a fever and they would get delirious, and then they would die. And basically, when pneumonia showed up in a 60 something or 70 something year old, let alone an 80-year-old, and they came to the hospital, everybody knew that was what was going to happen. That patient was almost certainly going to die. There was almost nothing they could do about it. And for a long time in the history of modern medicine, with heart attacks, strokes, there was no good medicine. There were no good interventions. Now you go to the ER, the hospital, they have all these fancy tools to alleviate blockages in the coronary arteries. And that's a whole nother discussion of how effective that is or not. I mean, you go to the hospital and they've got lots of things to offer you. And I mean, I've been there in the ER, on the hospital ward, in the ICU. A lot of what we do literally does save lives. And as much as people might want to, or might, question the ethics and the morality of the modern medical care, the reality is, what do people pay hospitals to do? They pay them to not let them die. So they're actually really, really, really good at that by and large. And there's plenty of room for improvement. I'm not saying there's not, but that's what the system is incentivized to do. And what Becker describes in the preface to his book is this revolution that overnight people were coming in with pneumonia who they knew would have died. And then with just what he describes as a sprinkle of white powder, they were being given another 5, 10, 15, 20 years of life. And I can tell you, as somebody who's worked in hospitals, night after night, day after day, week after week, I would have little old people coming in who were developing pneumonias and UTIs and all kinds of other infections. And I would give them just a couple of doses of antibiotics by IV with some fluids, some electrolytes. I would watch their vital signs normalize. I would watch them come back to life. And 4, 5, 6 days later, they're headed out the door back to their families, who are grateful that they get another 5, 10, 15, 20 years with grandma or grandpa or whoever they are. And that is, I think, the bedrock of the average person's faith in the conventional medical system is that shift from we can't do anything about anything in historical terms to all of a sudden this doctor and this pharmacist have a magical pill that can, get grandpa out of his acute delirium that otherwise would have culminated in his death. And it's sad that modern medicine has really fallen into the disrepair and ill repute that it now, I think, richly deserves, because there is that underlying value that it brings to the table. I mean, we still use antibiotics in my practice. We still use pharmaceutical drugs in my practice. We just don't throw them at people or put them on them forever. And we try to deprescribe, we try to get them off their meds. And we're very good at that. And what's ended up happening is the pharmaceutical industry found this incredible power and cachet of, oh my gosh, these drugs are saving lives. I mean, that's literally true, right? When you look at how antibiotics and other pharmaceuticals, their potential to save lives, it's real. It's not myth. It's not legend. It's verifiable. Not to mention IV fluids and all the rest of the meds and drugs and interventions we have in the hospital. But what ended up happening was they said, oh, well, we're going to do all that. And then we're going to come out with all these other drugs for all these other diseases where the drugs are not actually providing the value. And so it's just a classic case of a great idea, a great institution that went the way of all flesh, just like the Bible says it would, of becoming corrupted and falling into the hands of evil people who take good things and good ideas and twist them for evil purposes.
Yeah. Old Testament and New, witchcraft, sorcery,
Yes.
words pharmacia, the pharmacy. So
Yes.
it's like when people are like, well, I don't do drugs, but you go to the doctor, you have 15 prescriptions on your
Uh-huh.
counter. I'm not telling you stop, but I
Mm-hmm.
am saying you should do what you said. I never use that term. I think you should do everything possible to be as healthy as possible and have natural, just God-given solutions as
Yes.
possible. Now, if there's a drug you have to take, like you had a liver transplant, okay, you got to take that for the rest of your life unless you
Right.
study it and find a solution. There might be a solution, but until you find that solution, you want to take it or you're going to die. I get that kind of stuff. But man, we take pills for everything as a culture, and not just America, around the world. And, when people, they just stop using their brain. Like you were saying earlier with our children, we've programmed, they've consciously dropped the intelligence level and increased the stupidity level.
Mm-hmm.
And now you have people who walk around like zombies. And a mask stops a disease as well as a chain link fence in the water stops a goldfish. It's not going to happen. And when people are like, follow the science, I'm like, I am following the science. You look at scientifically the size of molecules and the size of the holes in the masks, they're going through. And this is retarded. And the whole thing was created by our own government in a way. And so we're not going to go there in this show. But what you're saying about these companies and people relying on the medicine, it's huge. So I want to ask
Mm-hmm.
you, if you want to add anything to that, feel free, Leland. But if not, I want to ask you a couple specific conversation questions to continue the conversation and help our listeners.
Yeah. Number one, I wrote a lot more about this in my book, Dying to Be Free, which people can check out and get on Amazon.com if they wish.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes to it.
Yeah. Right. So I wrote a lot more about it in that because I have a lot more to say, but happy to answer your questions.
Okay. So when it comes to, we talked about earlier about our children
Mm-hmm.
and how they're suffering. Why are our children suffering? Again, I don't believe if you go all the way left or all the way right, if
Mm-hmm.
you go all the way medicine or all the way holistic,
Yes.
anything out of balance is wrong. And if you eat too many carrots, you'll turn orange. Nothing wrong with a carrot, but if you eat too much, you're out of balance. And God talks Old Testament and New about balance and how a
Yes, he
false
does.
balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. So to all the parents right now who are raising children in general, but especially the parents, one of the worst things in the world is watching your kids sick and not knowing what to do. Like you said, your mom took you everywhere. She tried
Mm-hmm.
everything to find a
Mm-hmm.
solution for you and your sister. Parents, parents who care, will do almost anything for their kids. So the parents who are listening, or the children who are listening and are sick, or people who know kids that are just struggling, let's start off. What's, one, two, three tips that they can apply to their lives today, or things they can try to help them in the path of healing and free themselves from the suffering?
I would say the most important thing, and I do this, I try to do this every single day, is when you read the Bible with an eye to how God created the heavens and the earth, it should really make you think about why he did what he did. So God did not, and there's a line in, I think it's Ecclesiastes. It says, God has made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. The Bible mentions many times that the way we invent things is how we get into trouble. And, God's got a plan. He's got a design. If you go back to just simple early Genesis, just been exiled from the garden, he says, man, you are going to work hard all the days of your life to get the herb yielding seed of the ground to yield bread unto you, among other foods, right? And you're going to have to husband the animals so that they'll reproduce and you're going to be able to eat them, and, on and on. Right there, you've got a really powerful template for biblical living that has a lot implied in it that they didn't write about in Genesis because there was no other option. What am I talking about? Okay. God never in the Bible says you're going to live indoors in a artificially lit, artificially ventilated, artificially filtered world where you have no contact with the world that I created for you and told you to take dominion over and subdue. And I would add, replenish, because God also says you will replenish the earth. And so what has humanity done? Our attitude towards the earth tends to be very exploitative. Not how am I going to replenish it, but how can I pull as much out of the soil, whether you're talking about how much food can I grow, how many beef cattle can I get to grow and come to market on, the tiniest amount of acreage? How can I pull the most minerals out of this pit mine or out of this, whatever mine? So humans pollute the earth with heavy metals, with plastics, with all these things that are bad for us. And you don't have to live like a saint. You're going to have, like, I use plastic every day. If I could get away with living and engaging in the world and doing what I think God wants me to do without using plastic, I would do it. I'm working towards a less and less plastic life every day. You don't have to become a monk. You don't have to totally disengage from modern society, but you've got to be mindful of, well, what things are we doing as a society that are making us sick? And the more you view your world, your environment, your diet through a biblical lens, the more it becomes clear that, when we start tampering with God's design, we run into problems. Modern artificial light, I've mentioned multiple times now, is a disaster for the human mind, the human skin, the human nervous system, the human being. It's one of the most biblical examples I can come up with, because if you look at, what is Lucifer described at? He's described as portraying himself or appearing as an angel of light, right? So it's clear that he's also made out of light, but he's also the false light, right? He's the
And
morning
in
star.
First John, it says God is light, and in him is no darkness at all.
Right, exactly. And so, it's clear that we are challenged by the limitations of our senses and our knowledge as human beings, as fallen beings. We're challenged to perceive the difference between false light and true light, right? But if you unpack the biological effects of screens, tablets, smartphones, even wireless signals, we call them EMF, so radio and microwave radiations, from everything from, Doppler radar to, your smartphone, Bluetooth, cell phone. All of these things have a certain amount of a negative effect on biology. And I talked about Robert O. Becker. That was actually one of the reasons why his research ended up becoming sidelined by the powers that be back in the 80s. I mean, he was having grants pulled because he was coming out with research findings that the DoD didn't like because it got in the way of their agenda, as the military industrial complex, which I think really ultimately ended up bleeding over into what I call the medical industrial complex. So concrete things people need to do. They need to honor the fact that God created the human body to really be healed by light. This isn't controversial, even though it might seem so to many people. The reality is that we've got very strong data to show that avoiding the sun increases your risk of death as much as smoking. Let me say that again. If you are another way, and this is from a study called the Melanoma in Southern Sweden trial, if people feel like looking it up for some reason. If you were to smoke 2 packs a day and get as much sun as possible, let's say your job is stacking beach chairs, or you just happen to take a 2-hour lunch break every day to go sit in the sun. No sunscreen, no sunglasses, no hat, no sun protective devices or gear at all. If you were to do that, your risk of death would be the same as someone who didn't smoke but never went outside.
Yeah.
And yet the communication from health and wellness professionals that people get is avoid the sun because it causes skin cancer. I'll sometimes say, in all honesty, if the sun causes skin cancer, then spoons make people fat. Because the reality is skin cancer rates are doubling every couple of decades. And Americans have never lived a more indoor life. We spend 97, 98% of our time indoors.
Mm-hmm.
So if the sun causes skin cancer, but people have gone in the last 100 years from living almost 100% of their day outside in natural light to living almost 100% of their day indoors in artificial light, how does that make any sense? I would get it if it was a modest rise in skin cancer rates because people got older on average. So that makes sense. The more old people, more skin cancer, but the numbers don't add up. Rates of skin cancer should not be doubling at this point in human history if the sun causes skin cancer, because we've been a mostly indoor society now for 10, 20, 30 years, certainly my whole lifetime. So honoring the light that God made for us is critical for good health, and getting time outside and having natural light in our working spaces. I mean, I think modern office buildings they're just awful. These horrible fluorescent lights, they give people headaches, migraines. I think they affect people's mood. There's lots of research on this that's not well appreciated by the public because, no one is making a lot of money advertising the health benefits of the sun.
Yeah. And I want to comment on that because a
Mhm.
lot of people, there's been research for years that is proven about the sun and exposure helping with, let's just focus on one, depression.
Yes.
There's lights, like what do they call them? Happy lights.
Or
That they,
satellites. Yeah.
yeah, no, that's what I was going to get to. So you have happy lights that make people happier, like replaces if you're in Alaska and you get 23 hours in Fairbanks
Right.
of darkness for a season. They give them these happy lights.
Mhm.
Again, proven with reality. Forget studies.
Sure.
But nobody really talks about the concept that, well, if something can be positive, there could be something that's negative. Exactly what you're saying. Like all these indoor lights that we use in our house every day.
Mhm.
There is a massive problem with this, that there's only one side of the literature. And if you talk about it, you're a conspiracy theorist. No, that's just a label. It's you have a different opinion. I'd call it common sense for a lot of these conspiracy theories. But when you're talking about this in your practice, do you see the light bulbs go off in people's heads? Like, oh, I never thought about that. Like
Oh
5G
yeah.
phones.
Oh yeah.
In 2005, I had low level security clearance and I was watching videos of mobs protesting outside foreign governments, and they used directional sound. They called it then, but it was 5G. They pointed speakers at people, turned up the 5G, and they fell to the ground. They were screaming, grabbing their heads. And until the crowd dispersed, the government kept these 5G signals on. And
Yep.
now we're putting them in our freaking pockets and talking them all day. And
I
people
know.
don't expect that to be dangerous. So what do you see with your patients? How do you break the insanity?
Well, the number one thing that we do is put out a lot of content to prepare people for what to expect when they come to see us. It's very rare for someone to come into the medical practice who hasn't heard a long form podcast like this, who hasn't seen it, one of us, myself, my staff, speak at an event. Usually what ends up happening now, and I'm really grateful for this, is that consumers are becoming more and more informed because it's easier and easier for us to make content. I mean, 10, 20 years ago, it's like make content. People who did that were, I mean, professionals in audio, visual, audio, video, whatever. They had a lot of fancy equipment. They spent a lot of money on it. Now it's like you got a $500 budget to start your podcast, and you can have top quality audio podcasting mics, decent webcams, the whole thing. And you can stream it in 4K if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got more and more of a ability to reach people with content to help them understand. And so people are coming in expecting us to talk about this. And even when they don't, I mean, we just explain the science, we explain what they're seeing. And more, I think people are open-minded because they've really been blown away by how the map of the world that they were given in school that's portrayed by the mainstream media just doesn't line up to reality.
Like Lucky Charms being healthier than steak by the FDA of the US government.
What a joke.
How do people even process that? It's a literal piece, it's a bag of trash that even ants and animals won't eat. And
Yeah.
our government is telling people, see, to me, this is inexcusable. It's intentional harm. What is your take on it? Maybe you're a lot calmer than me, but I freaking hate it.
Well, I think that my fury over some of this is tempered by the fact that I've been aware of it going on since I was 15 or 16. And I started to read into the realities of what was going on with the medical industrial complex. And then, I spent 10 years in round numbers in hospitals watching the machine kind of grind on. And, do I still feel a lot of anger and rage when I hear about the things that people are subjected to by this very sick, corrupt system? Of course I do. But I also think that you have to channel that energy into something positive, and you also have to ask questions like, well, why do people behave this way? Why does a double digit proportion of the population think, oh, it's normal for the government to tell us that food that wild animals won't eat is healthy and nutritious? And that comes down to, because then when you understand that, you can actually start to take action to really help people. I really believe you have to meet people where they're at, and you may want to pull them out of where they're at, and they may not be willing to follow you. But if you genuinely care about people, and we've mentioned the Bible a lot. If you look at Jesus's example, he's got such a brilliant way of interviewing people. And there's this great book on this called Quiet Leadership that I was recommended years ago that lined up with what I found really helped with communicating to people about why they were in the situation they were in. And it's more about asking questions than it is about telling them how things are. And so, when I'm interviewing somebody, that's most of what I'm doing. I'm asking questions. And I think it was Socrates who said, I cannot tell anybody or teach anybody anything. I can only make them think. And I think that is right on.
Yeah, the method that Jesus uses in the Bible, again, all truth comes from God. All truth comes from Bible. And if someone's listening now, it doesn't matter if you agree or not, find a flaw in the Bible, you won't. So whether it's Jack Welch or Donald Trump, if it works, can guarantee it ties back to scripture and verse.
100%.
But they called it the Socratic method. Well,
Yes.
Socrates learned it from the examples written down about how Jesus lived. So the Socratic method is just what you're saying. It's Jesus's model.
Socrates lived after Jesus? I actually don't have that.
No, hold on. Let me clarify.
Okay.
The writings in the Bible that describe Jesus and how Jesus lived, he didn't learn from Socrates. Socrates learned from him. The Bible.
Got it. Including the Old Testament.
Yes.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's not Socrates came up and Jesus followed it. Jesus doesn't need Socrates is where I'm getting. Sorry about that.
I get it.
I skipped
100%.
dots in my head.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean though. So having that compassion and understanding for why people believe what they believe is, I think, critical to engaging with them in a conversation where you might actually move the needle on what they believe. So that's part of why, or I think a big part of why I think people are left, because at the end of the day, the human brain is frankly pretty simple. You can read, a couple hundred pages on what kinds of arguments people tend to respond to, and it's pretty short. I mean, And it's pretty quick to actually flesh it out. People will naturally tend to believe things they hear over and over again. They'll naturally tend to believe things that most other people around them believe. They'll tend to believe things that are coming to them from various types of authority figures, whether that's scientists or priests or rabbis or any other kind of authority figure. They'll tend to believe, religions as authorities. They'll tend to believe in governments. And a lot of that comes back to, what do people get conditioned to do? The people who tend to question authority have a way of winding up on the gallows, in prison, otherwise out of society. And so, the way that authority works, it tends to select for populations of people who are docile and accepting and obedient, rather than constantly questioning the narrative to try and figure out what's real and what's not. And I mean, some of that is just simple Pavlovian conditioning, right? The government punishes you for thinking outside the box. You're less likely to do it because you may not want to be punished again. And some of it is just simple, selection. The people who follow the party line did not get killed by the ruling party. And therefore, those people were allowed around to have kids, and they taught their kids to be docile and compliant and whatever, and on and on. And then, of course, this culminates in these giant civilizational crises where eventually violence, comes out, civil wars, revolutions, famines, coups, whatever you want to call them. And that's when basically, the strength of a society or a civilization is tested. And it always comes back to biblical principles. The people who followed the Bible wind up coming out on top always in the long run. And that's, the Old Testament over and over again. And, we see it in the pages of history since then without fail.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So going back to wrap things up with this section before we transition to where you are today, where you're heading, how can people continue the conversation and connect with you? When we talked about from, illness to wellness, talked about, we had a concrete point, get out in the light.
Yes.
What are some other concrete, whether someone right now is in India, whether someone is in Ireland, whether someone is in Indiana, America, what are some concrete things that all humans need to thrive that people can start today before they contact you?
Movement and physical exercise, which goes right back to Genesis. You're going to labor. He didn't mean, God, that is, didn't mean you're going to sit on a computer and type all day. We know that a sedentary lifestyle is not good for us. A certain amount of physical exercise is part of the deal if you want to live a long and healthy life. It's best to do it outside in natural light, for the record. And then eating food the way that God, I believe, intended. The long story on that, I think, is best told by a guy named Joel Salatin, who's a friend. I spoke at his farm a couple months ago on this topic. God wants us to not only take dominion and subdue the earth, but he also wants us to replenish it. And that means restoring nutrients, minerals to the soil. That's organic, regenerative, sometimes called biodynamic, although that's another story. Agriculture. So agriculture that honors these cycles that God has set up for carbon, nitrogen, minerals, all the nutrients of the biosphere going into and out of the soil, into and out of the plants we eat, the animals we eat, and then, of course, the waste of everything out of those cycles going back into the soil. So, I eat organic food. I try to eat as close to nature as possible. I really think it's important to get to know your local food system. Our country, people are really only as secure as their next meal. And if you're dependent upon farms that are thousands of miles away, your access to which could be cut off by wars, EMPs, natural disasters, how safe and secure are you really? And what kind of society are we creating if everyone just lives in a little apartment and, doesn't have any farmers around? We need farmers to have food and to have healthy local food. And, I think local food is really critical, because you'll find that the stresses of your native environment are the ones that are countered best by the food you're surrounded by. So, for example, in cold, dark places, there's not a lot of sunlight. Sunlight increases your body's needs for folate. It increases your body's needs for colorful pigments like beta carotene. You get those from the foods that you get those nutrients, things like folate and carotenoids or colorful pigments from plants that grow in tropical or subtropical or temperate environments in the spring and the summer. So eating a local seasonal diet is really wise. Now, we break a lot of rules. I'm not saying you should eat a local seasonal diet in Barrow, Alaska, because you may be working a 16-hour shift on something like a oil rig, or I don't know, something like that. And if you're doing that, there's a place for things that are out of season. So we get into all this with people we coach, but basically it's pretty simple. You want to eat whole natural foods raised in a way that replenishes and honors the earth, and not a bunch of processed garbage that's full of fillers and additives and fake crap that's been added to basically make them more palatable, more addictive, less nourishing, more apt to make you fat, sick, stupid, etc.
Awesome. I thank you very much for your time. And if someone wants to get a hold of you, if someone wants to continue the conversation, look into your coaching and your wellness programs, what's the best way to reach you?
So there's two places people should go. One of them is stillmanmd.substack.com. That's my personal blog. What you'll get there is my thoughts, my opinions, and it's just me. And I also publish a podcast now through that Substack, and it's called Integrative Medicine with Dr. Stillman, Dr. Leland Stillman. And then for the general newsletter, where you'll get updates on where I'm speaking, what I'm up to this week, how to connect with my team and the coaching business, that's stillmanwellness.com. So I encourage people to sign up for both email newsletters. We won't spam you. We won't sell your information. Our newsletters are purely informational. They just tell you about where we're going to be, what we're doing, and how we can help you.
Excellent. Now, between your birth and today, is there anything we missed about your life, or are there any closing thoughts you want to leave with our community before we wrap up this episode, Leland?
No, I think that was really pretty much covers everything. Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's an honor. And ladies and gentlemen, if you've been listening to this show for the last 5 years, you know our slogan is listen, do, repeat for life. If this is your first episode, listen, do, repeat for life. Dr. Leland talked about how if we don't take action, you said correct me if I'm wrong. You said the number one thing you saw with your patients in regular medicine is they have the knowledge, but they don't apply it, right?
Well, I said the number 1 and 2 reasons for people to fail are failure to execute and failure to engage. And
Yes.
They may or may not have the knowledge required, but we help them get the knowledge when they engage with us.
Yeah. And a lot of times, though, would you agree, even the best intentioned person, they don't execute on the knowledge you give them?
Absolutely. And that's part of engaging, is being held accountable.
Exactly. And the Bible talks about, it says, the talk of the lips tendeth only to penury. It means talk's cheap. So like our slogan says, listen to the good wisdom and information Leland gave you today, ladies and gentlemen. Do it each day. Repeat it each day consistently so you can have a great life in this world, but most importantly, in eternity to come. So I'm David Pasqualone. Please share this episode of the podcast with your family and friends. Dr. Leland, he gave you his website. There's a link in the show notes. Reach out to him. And again, Dr. Leland, I appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right. I agree. I feel the same way, and it's been an honor. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, we love you. Go have a great day. Apply what Dr. Leland taught you. Let him or I know if you need any help. We'll do whatever we can to help you, and we'll see you in the next episode. Ciao.
The Remarkable People Podcast. Check it out. The Remarkable People Podcast. Listen, do, repeat for life. The Remarkable People Podcast.